Very much. I don't know whether I should thank Federico for inviting me. That would be too much. It's a pleasure to share this panel with Ilan and Rodrigo. With Ilan, we share the same thesis, tutoring at the MIT, and in a couple of months we will all be getting together. All of Rudy's students will be getting together to give homage to him. We have a good relationship that has dated back to those times. And Rodrigo studied in Cambridge the moment we, with Peppo, were studying in Cambridge. So we did invite him to a few parties. So we have known each other for many years, and it's a pleasure to share the panel with these two friends. I'm going to divide my presentation into two parts. The first one is to tell you what the process has been like at the Central Bank of Argentina to date. And on a second stage, I will tell you what I learned these 2 days for our work and for the decisions we need to make now. I will start to where we started by late last year. We were faced in the monetary arena with 5 challenges that we had to deal with. The first one was that when we arrived, there was a process, the amount of money was growing approximately at 45%. You know that monetary policy operates with delays, so we were starting with some backpack, which was a strong monetary expansion in the past 6 months, in the previous 6 months. As you know, Cambiemos had based its electoral campaign on the basis of a unified foreign exchange rate. We believe that a pillar for normalizing the Argentine economy was to have a unified exchange market. Since Argentina had applied the restrictions in 2011, the economy had stopped growing, so this was something that we needed to correct, which would imply a rearrangement of the exchange rate, which ended up being a difference of 60%. The third challenge was that we needed relative prices changes, utility rates, the reduction of taxes to some exports. That also generated an additional challenge in terms of price evolution in the short term. And then another 2 topics that are a bit more specific, which are also very important. The first is that we had a very big contingent liability of futures transactions that the central bank had been involved in that would generate a monetary liability that ended up being 10% of the money base, so we had to deal with that. And finally, something that was also there and we didn't know how to quantify. A lot had been said about this among economists. What was going to happen with money demand? Because somehow the restrictions had limited people's demand for money. And given that from the campaign, the objective had been to standardize the market so that people could have the assets they wanted, there would be an impact on money demand that was very difficult to quantify, and the central bank technical staff, I can see the person who actually did that, this fall had been estimated as half a GDP point, so there were a series of factors that made this transition a challenge, because we're going to a more normalized economy, but from the point of view of monetary policy and price dynamics, there were some issues to deal with. What was the result of this before telling you how we started? If you take December to July, the result of this rearrangement as a movement, a 60% movement in the exchange rate, and the utility rates also being higher, this implied, adding to the inflation that Argentina already had from last year, it added an additional 12 points. So this entire process was done. When you think about 3% in Rodrigo's country, You would say 12% sounds like a lot, but considering the challenges and the dynamics, 12% is what was added to inflation in these 8 months, the entire cycle, until Argentina went back to the average inflation last year. That for our domestic economy. I am talking about the core inflation, 12% on core inflation. In the city of Buenos Aires, 13%. Now, if we are talking about the entire level, we need to add an additional 3 points because of the increase in utility rates, and 8 points more in the city of Buenos Aires because these new rates highly impacted on the city of Buenos Aires. So 12 to 13 inflation points were added to our core inflation as a result of the rearrangement process that I've just described. This was done with 4 elements. One component was instantaneous, another was day 4, the next was the next 3 months, and a component that started after month 4. The instantaneous component was that we went to a central bank that would tell the truth. The central bank had even lost that value. Telling the truth is a central element for building trust. So if a central bank says inflation is half of what it is very difficult to build trust. So the instantaneous measure was to say we will have a central bank that will always tell the truth. This was a bit where we were a bit concerned, and it's difficult to say this in front of foreigners, but the truth is that that was the situation. And this not only affected the central bank, but the entire administration. The second was to remove the limitations that had been applied in the foreign exchange market. We did this after 3 or 4 days. I said yesterday that we started a meeting at 12 noon to do this. We ended at 2 a.m. the next day because it was like a bomb. What cables should I cut so that it won't blow up? So we spent 14 hours trying to see what cables to cut. What we did at the beginning was to release all flows in the foreign exchange market, but not the stocks. The stocks were released gradually in subsequent months, and the process was finally completed on August 3rd when we completed the last measures to fully do away with these restrictions. It was a complex operation from the technical and regulatory points of view. This was a very complex scaffolding from the regulatory point of view, and we had the support of our staff and the central bank team, who were outstanding, and without them this would have been impossible. We had this amount of money that I mentioned before in the first 3 months. The main objective was to do away with the surplus, with money surplus. We started a significant process, and this process lasted December, January, and February. By late February, we had sort of rearranged the money market, and that is when we started the transition to inflation targets, putting the interest rate as a reference element for monetary policy so that monetary aggregates were endogenous. We offered selling and buying levac at 35 days. So any surplus of liquidity that was beyond this rate was absorbed or returned through interventions in the primary and secondary markets. That started on March 1st, 2016. We knew that we had relative prices to rearrange, so we had a hard monetary policy position, interest rate in 38%, which was right at that moment, to give a strong signal, and we said that in September this year we were going to formally announce convergence of inflation targets, which we'll do next Monday. Next Monday, we are going to present the operational framework with which the inflation targeting system will work as from next week. One decision that was very easy for us to make was to go to inflation targeting and not to any other mechanism to anchor the expectations of the economy. We ruled out the exchange rate. When there is lack of credibility and there is an anchorage on the exchange rate, you have to raise interest rates, so monetary policy becomes pro-cyclical. But we didn't have to analyze that because we did have the experience of Argentina. Argentina is full of stabilization processes, and we have focused on using the exchange rate as an anchor instead of focusing on the inflation rate and letting the exchange rate to act as a shock absorber for the economy, as they have seen with the Asian crisis. These were the 4 steps: removal of the restrictions, absorption of the surplus, and generating a monetary framework that would provide a framework of reference. People started talking about levacs, expecting things to happen. We started defining inflation targets or expectations, and we provided certainty regarding monetary variables. Much has been said. Ilan and Rodrigo have said it, and it was said yesterday as well. This requires some coordination with the executive branch and with the fiscal policy. There was a lot of coordination, and there still is a lot of coordination. We coordinated the targets with the common goal of reaching an inflation of 5% in the year 2019. The second coordination element is the exchange of titles or bonds. We did this in December when the executive exchanged some assets that the central bank had that were not allowed to be transferred, and they were changed for bonds with market value. This was a huge effort by the executive to consolidate the central bank balance sheet. This implied making payments for approximately $1 billion to the central bank from the executive to consolidate the balance sheet. This is not a topic that was much recognized as a big effort from the executive to the disinflation project. Another second issue we had to solve together with the Ministry of Economy was how to limit fiscal dominance, having selected a gradual system. So central bank transfers in a decreasing manner regarding the executive, but we somehow had to define, and it was decided to take nominal transfer amounts, 160 billion pesos. That value was defined. We said it early in January, and this is a figure which has been kept. And then, of course, there is the work that we did for the budget 2017, defining these variables. This has been published. We are going to discuss it in detail next Monday. You must have noticed I haven't seen anything written on this in the media, but the whole use of central bank reserve mechanisms have disappeared. This has been historical for the past 10 years, but now that disappeared from our budget. That is part of the coordination task between the central bank and the executive.
I'd like to stress the following fact. The government had 4 main goals, economically speaking: removing currency restrictions, resolving the holdouts problem, reducing the inflation rate, and reducing taxes in Argentina. The tax burden has been reduced, and we are attaining these 4 goals. Now we have a central bank which is independent, making autonomous decisions, and the society is really amazed at this change, and this has been taken to extremes. In the case of Argentina, we have a famous writer, Jorge Luis Borges, and Jorge Luis Borges has a short story, Pierre Menard and the Quixote, author of the Quixote. And he says, I'm going to become Cervantes. That's the main character. I want to become Cervantes, the writer of the Quixote. He lives the life of Cervantes and he writes the Quixote. But the interesting thing about Borges' short story is the text, including a paragraph from the Quixote written by Cervantes and a paragraph written by Pierre Menard. Both paragraphs are virtually identical. Of course, they look like being identical, but they are not. And Borges explains the difference. I say 4, 3, 2, 1 inflation, and the Minister of the Economy says 4, 3, 2, 1. And they say, well, why is it different, both statements by the central bank governor and the Minister of Finance? We're saying the same thing in a different way. And of course, we're saying, well, 4.1, 4.2, 4.3. This is what I wanted to share with you about the evolution of all these measures. Next Monday, we are going to keep on talking about these issues. We are presenting the operational framework of the Central Bank of Argentina concerning inflation targeting. What about the presentations we have heard all over these 2 days? There are 4 comments that I'd like to share with you, 4 thoughts. Number 1, I think that we have to rethink why we want to disinflate. Why do we want an economy without inflation? And I think that there are 2 core elements. The following. 1, distribution. That is to say, inflation, the inflationary tax, is a tax affecting much more these low-income people because it has a moral effect, wealth distribution, income distribution, and it has also an effect on growth. When Jose and Rodrigo mentioned the process of disinflation, and please take notice that the disinflation process in Chile was conducted during the golden decade of growth for Chile, as Rodrigo mentioned this period. In the case of Israel, yesterday, we saw that they were able to reduce after 20 years of chronic inflation in the 1990s, and they started to grow exponentially, speaking as from inflation reduction. So a strong period for growth means building an economic system that is workable and will allow for growth, thinking about all these issues, the issues we have seen, how to reduce costs, how we can reduce inflation, how we can have a forward-looking view rather than speaking about inflation. And this has to do with equity as well. And this also has to do with the so-called sacrifice ratio, which is the cost of all this. If we want to go to a zero inflation economy, growing on a structural basis all the time, I think that the experiences that we have discussed in the course of this seminar makes us much more aware of the fact the Argentinian economy should have a reduced inflation rate. Bullet point number 2. Comment number 2. How are we going to evolve along these lines? I'd like to share with you a specific comment on the Israel's presentation yesterday. Israel had currency bans in place, sharing some features with Argentina because people think about purchasing real estate in dollars, and they are thinking about dollarized contracts, chronic inflation for a long time, so they implemented currency bonds whereby they could maintain inflation by using the rate of exchange as an anchor. In the 1990s, at the very beginning, they changed their view, their approach, and they said, we're going to forget about the exchange rate, and instead of having a currency ban with exchange rate as an anchor, the exchange rate will float according to a trend, and the trend was the inflation target somehow. So the society started to think about the dollars less and started to think about the slope more. I mean, the inflationary curve slope. And correct me if I'm wrong, at that time, there was a sort of collapse because they had to coordinate ideas along the lines of finding a common variable. How can we coordinate what we are going to coordinate? Well, we are going to coordinate the inflation rate, and I think that Israel teaches us how to do so, how to focus on the inflation rate and reducing it. Third comment, velocity. Speed, how fast we can evolve or we cannot evolve. We have already mentioned the Colombian case. It took them 10 years to disinflate. But without taking into account that Colombia had an institutional framework, 100% indexation scenario, it was absolutely legal. Uribe, the central bank president, and governor in Colombia, and the president of Colombia has also told me so. In our case, the whole thing is different because this inflation is not that easier. Think about these examples. In Chile, the whole process took 4 years between 1990, yes, please, yes, 1991, 1995, well, no, 1990 and 94, in 4 years. Well, I feel reassured about that because our disinflation process will take us 4 years as well, without any restriction on legal indexation. Because in Argentina, in the early 1990s, as a result of high inflation over a long period of time, the currency convertibility law prohibiting indexation, and of course, this is the only thing that it persists in the currency convertibility law. And this was supported by the governing party as well as the opposition party. And we said no indexation. We went to Congress and we didn't want to have indexation, even though prices had risen sharply throughout that decade. Chile, well, 4 years in the process with indexation. We're going to do that without indexation. Arminio mentioned yesterday that when he introduced inflation targeted in Brazil, the main goal was one-digit inflation 15 months after taking office. Then, while we were having dinner, he told me we had lowered inflation, we wanted to anchor everything. This is what he told me. And a third comment that we had over dinner yesterday by Carnine, 10 years before, if she had been asked what is the main challenge of the Central Bank of Israel not attaining inflation targeting, was absolutely unbelievable at that time. And what do I want to tell you? That changes if we are consistent, if we do things well, if we are coherent, changes will surprise us and they will be much quicker than expected, as it happened in many of the countries, the friends that have visited us. Stefan mentioned today that cash was 39% of transactions, and in only 4 years it was 23%, and they were amazed at the speed of such changes. It doesn't take, of course, weeks or months, but it does not take decades. This means being consistent for some years. And comment number 4, Rajan stressed the following fact: that there's a structural change operated by inflation targeting with real interest rates. We need them to reduce inflation and also in the steady state, because the only way of getting credit is the fact of having savers, people who want to save money within the financial sector. In the afternoon yesterday, Argentina has a significant capacity for saving, which is not different from other countries, but intermediation, financial intermediation, is absolutely minimal and negligible vis-a-vis other countries with the same savings rate. rates. And this is not surprising because we are familiar with it. Now, this positive rate won't only change the mindset of the depositor who is going to trust banks and allow financial intermediaries to conduct financial intermediation, because you are investing at negative 2% because of the inflation, and think about dollars or pesos or whatever in the financial system that may be loaned to an SME that is going to pay 4, 5, or 6%, producing value for more than 5 or 6%. We are really wasting 8, 9 points per year, points of return concerning that savings, because we are not intermediating all those transactions through the financial system. This has created a very agitated situation, as Rajan mentioned yesterday. Many people did have access to low-cost funding. Arminio mentioned financial system as a parasite of inflation, and part of that inflationary tax was transferred by banks into negative real interest rates, create an operation for companies that is wholly different from a scenario where the interest rate is positive. Let me share an example. If you have a negative rate, accumulating inventories, build them up is a center for creating income and profits. You are buying a real asset moving along inflation, and you are creating, of course, a benefit that is under inflation. Or when the rate is positive, it is no longer a wealth center or a profit center, and of course you have to keep an eye on how it works concerning the logistics of inventories. Now, if we don't pay depositors a positive real interest rate, we are going to do every kind of mumbo jumbo. We are not going to have bank deposits. We're not going to have loans and credits. And in special, Rajan was very clear in this regard yesterday. In concluding, I'd like to show the picture of a virtuous cycle, which is possible. This virtuous cycle where reducing inflation, according to the experiences that we have held, lead to an increase in productivity in the economy as a rate of inflation that will make prices useful, elastic curves of demand. Because the consumer won't be even seeking to have information on prices. They don't know if the monopoly power of the distribution is increasing. This does not mean that are bad and good guys. It happens because it loses the power of information, consumers. And of course, if the inflation is reduced, risks are also reduced, and we dare to invest, to consume, and we are along this right path. I think that this seminar has taught us, at least for us in Argentina, in a very humble way, lessons learned by listening to fruitful experiences from our visitors. Thank you very much.